They started with whispers. Small things. Doors that closed by themselves, shadows passing too quickly, until the terror became impossible to ignore. These are not made-up stories. They are real events experienced by ordinary people like you and me, but who, for some reason, ended up looking evil in the eye. Today you will hear 3 stories so disturbing that some would rather have never heard them. But you are here, and now it is too late to turn back. Neighbors and thin walls. On an ordinary night in an ordinary building, something not so ordinary happened. Claire Morgan, 34, had just sat down to read as she did every night. But that Wednesday the silence of the apartment was interrupted by something disturbing. A scream coming from the wall next door. It was not just any scream, it was a desperate call for help, as if someone was being tortured on the other side of the thin wall. Claire froze. The book slipped from her hands and she held her breath, trying to understand if this was real. The voice sounded feminine, trembling, full of desperation. She leaned closer to the wall, pressing her ear against it, and heard it again. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" A shiver ran down her spine. This was not a joke, nor a common fight. This was something different. Without thinking twice, Claire picked up the phone and called the police. Within minutes, 2 police cars arrived at the building. She led the officers to the apartment next door, pointing firmly. "This is it. I heard it. Someone is calling for help." But when the door was broken down, all they found was silence and darkness. The apartment was empty. Completely empty. Claire had moved into that building only 3 months ago, after a complicated divorce. She wanted peace, to start her life over, to forget her traumas. She had chosen that place for its tranquility, its security, and, above all, for the feeling of anonymity. It was an old building with thin walls and silent hallways, but she liked it that way. Until that night. Before the screams, her routine was predictable. She worked as a freelance illustrator and spent most of her time at home. Her days were filled with coffee, instrumental music, and long readings. She was a rational, skeptical, and not very impressionable woman. Claire didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or paranormal stories. At least not until then. But after that scream, something inside her changed. That night became a turning point. Even with the apartment next door completely empty, she knew what she had heard. It was real. It was human. And it wasn't the first time something strange had happened there, although she didn't know it yet. The worst part is that it wouldn't be the last. In the following days, Claire tried to move on with her life. She tried to convince herself that it was just an outburst, an auditory illusion caused by fatigue. But deep down she knew that it wasn't that. The feeling that something was wrong in the apartment next door wouldn't leave her alone. And then the noises started. Not screams, not yet, but subtle scratches, faint knocks, as if someone was walking barefoot, or crawling. On the 3rd night at 2:47 a.m., Claire woke to a sound like muffled crying coming from the wall. She got up silently, her heart hammering in her chest, and put her ear to the wall again. The voice was there. Faint, as if it were far away, but clearly saying, "They won't let me leave." Claire backed away from the wall, shaking. This was no longer imaginary. It was real. And it was terrifying. She went to the building's superintendent, an older man named Mr. Delaney, and told him everything. He just shook his head and said in a low voice, "You're not the first to hear things coming from that apartment. But I advise you not to get involved, Claire." That answer only made things worse. If other people heard it too, then what was going on in there? Determined to understand what she was facing, Claire began to investigate on her own. She searched through old building records, talked to neighbors, and discovered that the apartment next door for 06 had been empty for almost a year. The last tenant had disappeared without a trace, a young woman named Naomi Parker, 26. Officially, she had abandoned the property. But nothing was found inside except a torn notebook, and stains on the floor that were never explained. Claire managed to find a former floor neighbor, a woman named Lorna Bell, who had moved out shortly after Naomi disappeared. When Claire mentioned apartment 406, Lorna turned pale. "I heard things. Every night. Crying, cries for help, furniture being dragged. But when the police came, it all disappeared. They said it was all in my head. But I know what I heard." Claire felt a chill run through her body. She wasn't alone. On impulse, Claire went back to her apartment and put her ear to the wall once again. This time there were no screams, no crying. Just breathing. Slow. As if someone was waiting. Although scared, Claire decided to file a new report. That night the sounds had gotten worse. It was as if someone was being dragged, banging on the walls, begging for help. The police returned to the scene, once again reluctant, once again skeptical. When the officers entered 406, Claire waited outside, tense, her eyes fixed on the half-open door. Minutes passed in silence. Then one of the officers, Officer Reed, came out and said, "Nothing. No furniture, no signs of a break-in. No trace." Claire persisted, "Didn't you hear anything? No noise, nothing strange?" Reed just shook his head. But before he said goodbye, he said something that sent chills down her spine. "You live alone, right? Because it sounded like someone whispered your name when we came in." Claire felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That didn't make sense. The apartment was empty. But how did anyone know her name? That night she didn't sleep. She sat on the couch with a kitchen knife in her hands, staring at the wall. The feeling of being watched was almost physical. And for the first time, Claire felt truly afraid. The next day, Claire decided she had to get into 406. Alone. And she wasn't going to wait for the police. She knew the building manager had a spare key, and after much insistence, she managed to get him to lend her one, but not before hearing a cold warning, "Don't stay there too long." When she turned the doorknob and entered, the air in the place seemed heavy, as if something inside rejected her. The apartment was indeed empty, but there was dust on the floor, except for a mark in the corner as if something had been dragged. Claire followed the trail and found, among the loose floorboards, an object. It was a small notebook with a black cover, with the initials NP engraved in gold. Naomi Parker's diary. The pages were stained and torn, but some of the notes were still legible. "They come at night," one of them read. "They speak within the walls. They say there is no way out." And on the last legible page, Claire found the sentence that would keep her awake at night. "If anyone is reading this, run. They know you here. Now they hear you too." After finding Naomi's notebook, Claire felt herself becoming more and more involved in something she couldn't understand, but which now seemed very real. The words from the diary echoed in her mind, "They know you here, and worst of all, now they hear you too." With each step, she felt something approaching, like a silent shadow about to swallow her. She no longer knew who to trust, and reality seemed to distort around her. That night, Claire decided to confront whatever it was that was there. She locked the doors and windows, closed all the curtains, and sat in the living room, staring at the wall that separated her apartment from 406. Then something happened. The breathing she had heard weeks ago returned. The same slow, deep breathing now coming directly from the wall. Claire stood up, almost automatically, and placed her hand on the cool surface. That was when she felt it. A vibration. A pressure. Something was there, on the other side, trying to communicate. But before she could react, the wall around her seemed to crack. She stepped back and the pressure increased. A voice whispered from the other side of the wall, "You're so close, almost there." Fear gripped Claire. She knew she was closer to the truth than she had ever imagined, but she also knew that the truth could be deadly. The next morning, Claire woke with the feeling that something had changed. The room seemed denser, as if the air had been compressed. She looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. It was then that she noticed the door to 406 open. When she walked in, the apartment was different. The musty smell, the dust, everything seemed still, as if time had frozen. But in the center of the room, something was waiting for her. An old, worn wooden chair was positioned toward the wall where Claire had felt the pressure the night before. And sitting on it was Naomi Parker. Her eyes were empty and her skin looked pale, almost translucent. But as Claire approached, Naomi raised her hand, pointing to the wall behind her, and whispered, "They're with you now. And they'll be with you until you become like us." The wall began to shake, and a fissure appeared, revealing absolute darkness on the other side. Claire tried to run, but something pulled her into the room. She screamed, but no one heard her. When the police arrived hours later, the apartment was empty again. But Naomi's notebook was there with one last note, "Now it's your turn. They know you listen." When Father John Montgomery received the call for help, he never imagined that this exorcism would mark a turning point in his life. The family of young Victoria Thompson was desperate, reporting unexplained events happening inside their home. Objects were being thrown against the walls for no apparent reason, voices echoing in the hallways, and most terrifying of all, Victoria's physical and mental transformation. She, who had always been a sweet and gentle girl, began to exhibit frightening behaviors. Maniacal laughter, convulsions, and a strength that defied logic. With each passing day, the situation worsened, and the family's desperation led them to seek the help of an experienced priest. Father Montgomery, a retired priest with decades of experience dealing with supernatural cases, knew that this type of request was rare, but he also knew that it could be a dangerous trap. He listened attentively to the family's stories, But what disturbed him most was the insistence that Victoria spoke in unknown tongues, and in moments of extreme anger, her face seemed to change, taking on a demonic expression. The old house where the family lived, an isolated Victorian building on the outskirts of town, seemed almost in tune with what was happening inside it. Something was definitely wrong there. But what exactly? What or who was taking possession of Victoria's soul? With quick and determined thinking, Father Montgomery prepared himself for what he knew would be the most challenging exorcism of his career. Upon arriving at the house, he was immediately confronted by a heavy atmosphere charged with dense energy. The air seemed thicker, and the very silence of the house gave him chills. He was greeted by a pale Victoria with red and empty eyes, without a trace of the young woman she had once been. The atmosphere, charged with something supernatural, was about to swallow everyone inside. What Father Montgomery did not know was that this exorcism would be like no other, and that the greatest challenge of his life was about to begin. The beginning of the exorcism was somber. Father Montgomery, armed with his faith and the knowledge he had acquired over the years, recited the sacred words with a calm that contrasted with the chaos unfolding around him. Victoria, who had remained motionless until then, began to shake violently. Her hands rose on their own as if pulled by invisible forces, and her eyes, previously empty, were now filled with a bright, unnatural light. She began to speak in an unknown language, her words mixing screams and whispers that made the priest's skin crawl. With each word uttered, the atmosphere inside the house seemed to worsen, as if the space itself were being distorted by the presence of something evil. As the exorcism progressed, the paranormal phenomena intensified. The sound of the priest's words seemed to have no effect, and Victoria's resistance grew fiercer and fiercer. She writhed unnaturally, her voice turning into a guttural growl, completely unlike her own. The priest tried to maintain control, but soon realized that there was something more at play. This was not just an ordinary possession. Something deeper and darker was trying to manifest itself, something he had never faced in his years of exorcisms. The fear, which he had always been able to control, began to infiltrate his mind. What he was facing seemed beyond human comprehension. That was when the entire house began to vibrate, as if it were being swallowed by an invisible force. The walls became thinner and the furniture moved on its own, banging against the walls in a rhythmic sequence, as if the evil itself was reacting to the attempted expulsion. Victoria, now unrecognizable, began to scream with an unearthly force, her words sounding like a lament, but also like a warning. The priest realized that he was no longer just fighting against Victoria's possession, but against something that was not of this world. Something that challenged him. And with each step he asked himself, could he really overcome what was there? Or was Victoria's case a mistake that he would never be able to correct? Father Montgomery knew that with each passing second, Victoria was becoming more distant from herself. The fight against the evil that dominated her seemed to intensify with each gesture, with each word. He recited the prayers with more fervor, but the words of power seemed to be swallowed by Victoria's deafening scream, which no longer sounded like a human being. Her body contorted in impossible ways, and the house seemed to react as if it were an extension of the devil himself. Furniture fell on its own, window panes cracked without explanation, and the sound of possession seemed to echo off the walls, creating a space where reality and the supernatural mixed. Meanwhile, Victoria's family watched in shock, unable to help or understand what was happening. They who had once been filled with hope, were now consumed by anguish and fear. Their daughter, the young woman they had grown up loving, was being destroyed before their eyes, and nothing seemed capable of saving her soul. Father Montgomery, now visibly shaken, tried to keep his faith intact. But deep down, a cruel doubt haunted him. Was he truly prepared to face what was there? Or was the evil greater than any exorcism could combat? The atmosphere in the house seemed even more oppressive, as if the very air itself was being sucked into a dark vortex. The dim light of the candles flickered, and the sound of Victoria's voice, full of hatred, seemed to fill every corner of the place. The exorcism was far from complete, and Montgomery felt that something was about to happen, something he could not control. Deep in his heart, a chilling feeling began to grow. Perhaps this was an exorcism he would not be able to finish. Father Montgomery, exhausted and clouded by fear, realized that he was fighting not just Victoria's possession, but something much more ancient and powerful. As he struggled to maintain his position, something astonishing happened. The atmosphere in the house changed completely. The shadows on the walls began to take on grotesque shapes, and a deep, booming voice that was not Victoria's began to speak. The demon within her had finally revealed itself. The voice was filled with malice, and its words carried an imminent threat. The revelation was terrifying. The demon possessing Victoria was no ordinary spirit. It was an ancient entity, a being that had tormented many families over the centuries. Worse still, the priest knew with a chill that this was a presence far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced in his life. This evil was not limited to simple possession. It was a force that was after something more, something that not even Father Montgomery fully understood. Victoria's possession was only the beginning of a much more terrifying plan. The final confrontation, which until then had seemed like a traditional exorcism, turned into an intense spiritual battle. The priest, with what little faith he had left, found himself forced to confront the evil itself head-on, with no more prayers or incantations that could save Victoria. In a moment of desperation, he cried out, "In the name of Christ, may this soul be freed." But the answer was even more terrifying. The demon only laughed, a laugh that seemed to echo throughout the house, and said, "You will never be able to finish this exorcism. She is mine now, and it will never end." What the priest did not know was that what was happening in that house was just one part of a larger cycle, a cycle that he could not break, not even with the strength of his faith. Father Montgomery felt an indescribable weight on his shoulders as he found himself without options. The evil within Victoria was growing stronger with every word, with every movement, and the feeling of helplessness began to take over his soul. He had faced possessions before, but nothing compared to this. The young Victoria, who had once been a person full of life and hope, was now an empty shell, taken over by an entity that seemed impossible to defeat. He remembered the words he had heard about ancient exorcisms, about rituals that involved more than prayers and sacred symbols. Something inside him led him to believe that perhaps he needed something more than his own faith to win this battle. He then remembered an ancient ritual, something rare and very risky, that had been passed down only to the most experienced and prepared exorcists. It was a technique known by many as the ultimate sacrifice. The ritual involved the total surrender of oneself, one's soul and one's spiritual energy, in order to seal away the evil. Although the priest knew that this ritual could be fatal, he felt he had no choice. What was at stake was not only Victoria's life, but also the future of his own soul. He knew the price would be high, but his only hope lay in this desperate ritual. With the candles flickering and the air heavy with tension, the priest prepared himself for the ultimate sacrifice. He knelt before Victoria, who was now completely possessed, her eyes black as darkness. The demon within her looked at him with a sinister smile and said, "You cannot defeat me. You are weak. There is no escape from this fate." But the priest, with a heart filled with determination and courage, began the ritual. His voice, soft at first, grew stronger as he recited the forbidden words. But as he spoke, a growing sense of fear took hold of his body. He felt his life force being drained, as if the shadow itself were being destroyed. It was a normal night at the Riverside Emergency Center, but something that morning was about to change Detective Jake Miller's life forever. The clock read 3:42 a.m. when the emergency phone rang, breaking the absolute silence of the place. Jake, exhausted after hours of work, answered without much expectation, but the voice that came on the other end of the line made his heart race. It was a child, and her voice was full of panic as if she were in trouble. "Please help. The house is on fire, I'm trapped inside," begged the low, trembling voice of a boy. The detective, still trying to process what he had just heard, began asking questions, trying to find out the address and the situation. But the child's answers were vague and disjointed, which increased the feeling that something was wrong. "Where are you? What's your name?" Jake asked, trying to remain calm. However, what the child answered put the detective on alert. "You know the house. It burned down 20 years ago," the voice said, shaking. Jake froze. How was that possible? He knew very well that the house, located on the outskirts of town, had been destroyed by a terrible fire 2 decades ago, killing an entire family. The call didn't make sense. With his mind racing, Jake tried to make sense of the situation. He looked at the address the child had given, trying to find some clue. But nothing made sense. The house no longer existed, and the child clearly couldn't be calling from there. "Who are you?" Jake persisted, tension growing in his voice. The child hesitated, and before he could answer, a series of strange clicks and noises came over the line, as if something was trying to communicate through the phone. Jake's heart raced and he felt a chill run down his spine. Something supernatural was happening, but what? As the detective tried to trace the source of the call, his hands shook, and a growing sense of unease took hold of him. He had dealt with countless emergency situations during his career, but nothing compared to what was happening at that moment. The child's name seemed to escape his memory, but the story of that house burning 20 years ago was etched in his mind as if it were yesterday. Jake remembered everything: the screams of the neighbors, the fire quickly consuming the structure of the house, and the desperate sound of the firefighters trying to put out the flames. But there was something he couldn't forget. Something that haunted him for years. The family that lived there had disappeared without a trace, and the case had never been completely solved. With his mind full of questions and his chest tight, Jake began to connect the pieces of the puzzle. Is someone playing a joke on me? He asked himself, trying to shake off the growing feeling that something was very wrong. But soon what seemed like a simple emergency call turned into a nightmare. The police officer remembered a detail that he had kept in his memory for years, but had never told anyone. He had been the first to arrive at the scene of the fire, and when the flames were extinguished, something strange was found among the rubble. A single toy. A dirty, burned but intact teddy bear. It was as if the child had been there all along, waiting for someone to listen. With the past haunting his mind, Jake realized that he was not dealing with a simple emergency. The child on the line was not a mistake nor a prank. It was something deeper, something that was connected to a dark secret that he had ignored for so many years. The call seemed to have come from beyond, like a cry for help from an unresolved past. And with it, a single question began to form in his mind. Could he finally solve the mystery of the burning house, or was he about to lose himself in a web of terror and suffering? As Jake tried to process what was happening, the voice of the child on the line sounded increasingly desperate. She was starting to cry, and her words were more fragmented, as if she were pulling away from the phone. "They're coming, they're here," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. Jake didn't know how to react, but one thing was clear: the child was in danger. He tried again more firmly. "Who's there? What do you mean? Where are you now?" But the answer that came was even more disturbing. "They're calling me," the child said, before a deafening sound of static filled the line. And then absolute silence. The tension in Jake's chest only grew. The phone felt hot in his hands, and the feeling that something was wrong, very wrong, only intensified. He tried to reconnect, but the line was now dead. There was no sign of the child or any strange sounds. Yet something was wrong. Changed inside Jake. He knew that what had just happened was not a simple mistake or a mistaken call. That child was trying to send him a message, and the only thing he could do now was try to understand what she was trying to say. But what he was about to discover would unearth a mystery buried for decades, and Jake had no idea how deep and terrifying it was. With his mind racing, Jake found himself faced with a dilemma. How to solve a case that seemed to have been closed for 20 years. Was the child somehow connected to the fire, but in what way? And who or what was calling her? The words "they're coming" hammered in Jake's mind, like an echo, and he knew he could no longer ignore what was happening. Something bigger was at play. Something supernatural. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders and, at the same time, a strange sense of dread. Not only did the child need help, but perhaps the key to solving the mystery was exactly what Jake had been afraid to face: the dark past of that house. Determined to find answers, Jake decided to return to the place where the house had burned down, a place he had avoided for years. He knew there was nothing there anymore, just the rubble and vegetation that now took over the land. However, something told him that what he was looking for was hidden there, waiting to be found. When Jake arrived, the scene was silent and desolate, and the place seemed as empty as he had imagined. But as he walked through the land, something caught his attention. A small area of the ground was slightly sunken, as if something had been buried there long ago. The detective bent down and carefully began to dig. His fingers touched something hard, something that seemed to resist the pressure. After a few minutes, he finally revealed the object: a small, ancient wooden box covered in dust and soot. When he opened the box, a wave of shivers ran through his body. Inside was a photograph of a family, the former residents of the house that had been destroyed by fire. But what Jake hadn't expected was the terrifying detail he found in the photo. The boy who had spoken to him on the phone was there, smiling with his family. He looked like the same boy, only much younger. The revelation took his breath away. How could this be possible? The boy on the phone looked exactly like the youngest son of the family in the photo. Jake felt a chill. He was beginning to understand, but there was still a huge missing piece of the puzzle. Why was the child calling now 20 years later? And why had no one talked about the family's disappearance in this way? Jake knew he was about to face something beyond human comprehension, something that would defy logic and reason. He was about to discover that the fire was not just an accident, and that the truth about what had happened in that house was about to be revealed in a terrifying way. With the photograph in his hands, Jake was more determined than ever to find out what had really happened in that house. But as he dug deeper and deeper into the old documents about the fire, something strange began to happen. He noticed that the name of the child, the same boy from the photo, was never officially recorded as deceased. Instead, there was a blank line on the page where the name should have been. Something was deeply wrong, and Jake felt as if he were becoming involved in a conspiracy that no one had ever dared to question. Over the next few days, Jake dug deeper into the history of the family that lived in the house. He discovered that the mother and father had a very close relationship with the former police chief, but the exact details of that connection remained unclear. However, there was one detail that puzzled him: a series of fires that had occurred in the town in the years following the fateful house fire that seemed to have been orchestrated in order to mask something even more terrible. The child's name, Noah, continued to appear in all the documents, but with one peculiarity: it was always shrouded in a kind of silence, as if its memory were being deliberately erased. Jake could no longer ignore the truth that was unfolding before his eyes. The boy in the photo, the child on the line, was no ordinary victim. He was the key to an even deeper mystery, one that no one wanted revealed. Noah had somehow been kept alive, or at least his soul was somehow trapped in an endless cycle. Jake had a chilling feeling that the fires he had investigated were not mere accidents, but part of a vendetta, a revenge of the dead. Now he had a choice to make: turn back and abandon the investigation, or move forward and find out what was happening, waiting for him and the boy in the darkness. As Jake neared the conclusion of his investigation, a feeling of inexplicable terror took hold of him. Deep in his heart, he knew he was about to face something that defied all the laws of reality. He followed the clues to the old family home, now completely destroyed, but something made him believe that there, in the absolute emptiness, there was still something. When he entered the land once more, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. But this time, there was a presence there, something invisible but palpable, as if the eyes of something were watching him. Suddenly he heard a sound, that of a child calling his name. Jake. Jake? The voice echoed through the air, making him turn quickly. He looked around, but there was no one. The feeling that something was watching him grew. Then, a faint glow appeared on the horizon of the burned house. What started as a small light slowly transformed into a familiar figure. Jake froze as he recognized who was approaching. It was Noah, but he no longer looked like a living child. His skin was pale, his eyes dull and empty, and an aura of darkness surrounded him. He looked like a specter, a lost soul filled with pain. You finally came," Noah's voice came out as a whisper. "Now you'll understand what happened. Now you'll pay for what they did." Dread gripped Jake. He had already known something supernatural was at play, but what the boy was hinting at was something much deeper and more sinister. Noah's eyes glowed with a fury of vengeance, and the scene transformed into a vivid nightmare, where the line between the living and the dead disappeared. The last cry for help had been given, and the detective was about to learn the price of the truth. The past was never buried. It was there, in front of him, ready to be confronted.